Okay, everyone. Well, we're trying out a bit of a new thing here on Irish and the American Civil War. We're moving into the field of video recording our chats among the editorial group of Irish and the American Civil War. It's an idea we've had. We're thinking we're going to put some of it onto podcasts as well, but every few weeks, just have a general conversation, often among ourselves, but sometimes hopefully with some invited guests, discussing things like quotes, objects, different sorts of documents, and different times of the year, looking at things like anniversaries or specific engagements, things that kind of relate to the Irish and the American Civil War, the Irish in 19th century America, and indeed emigration in general. So we're delighted to kick this off. We haven't got a proper name for this yet, but we will come up with one, we hope, over the next few weeks. It's appropriate, given the anniversaries of this month, that we have suffered some casualties. Before we even begin, our colleague Dr. Catherine Bates, and unfortunately is down sick and isn't able to join us for episode 1, but she'll be joining us, I think, later on. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Damian Shields. I set up Irish and the American Civil War around about 2010, and I've kind of been working in and around the American Civil War and Irish involvement in immigration for a lot of the time since. Brendan, I'll let you introduce yourself. Brendan, Associate Editor with the Irish and the American Civil War.
Yep, Brendan Hamilton. And I got started, how long ago was it now? Like 8 years or so, where I started emailing you.
Yeah, I'd say
submissions and stuff to the website.
Yeah. And a lot of the best posts on the site are by Brendan. One of the nice things we have in this that I'm hopeful will kind of feed into the chats that we have as we go forward is that we're all kind of based in different places and come from different places. So I'm originally from Ireland, currently living in Finland. Catherine is Welsh, and Brendan is American. So we have we have all angles covered, and it's something I think I've often felt that with the American Civil War, particularly when you're dealing with immigrants in the American Civil War, that you get a lot of good perspectives if you're bringing people from an American point of view, looking at, say, Irish and the American Civil War, and then people with an Irish point of view. It brings different bits of knowledge about people's origins, maybe where people died in the US, that I think we kind of miss sometimes. But yeah, so hopefully that'll be useful as we continue. And it's going to be useful tonight because Brendan, I hope, is going to be sharing some of his expert knowledge gleaned from a lifetime of Thanksgivings. Given that we're in December, the things that we were just going to discuss this time are the recently past Thanksgiving holiday and Christmas, which is coming up, looking back at the Irish in the Civil War in particular and how they celebrated those. And also this week was the 160th anniversary of the Battle of Fredericksburg, which of course was the seminal battle for the Irish Brigade in the American Civil War. And so they're the kind of two areas we're going to loosely chat about over the next 30 minutes or so. But we're going to start each of these little discussion pieces with, as I was saying, a quote or a document or an object. And if we kick off with Thanksgiving, I think one of the really important things, certainly from my work that's come out, when we're looking at the Irish, we tend to kind of concentrate on the holidays where they declared their Irishness. So things like St. Patrick's Day are huge, aren't they? So, but when you start looking at Irish correspondence, particularly, say, enlisted men's correspondence from the war, you see the importance of American holidays to a lot of them. And they're trying to do something with a lot of this. They're, in my mind, embracing American culture, which is telling us, I think, a bit about how they thought about themselves. So I just thought I'd read out one example of an Irishman's letter from the period. And he is a man called Michael J. Callanan. And he was writing letters back to the main ethnic newspaper, Irish ethnic newspaper in New York, the Irish American Weekly. He had been a laborer, and then in 1864 he enlisted in the U.S. Navy, and he was put onto the ironclad Onondaga, which was serving on the James River in Virginia, where it was engaging with things like rebel batteries. But he writes a letter that's published, dated the 28th of November 1864. And he attempts to get a bit of humor in. By the way, he wrote under a pen name Gary Owen, which is well known. I think, Brendan, in America, wouldn't it be associated with the 7th U.S. Cavalry?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, and Custer and his boys. Gary Owen is actually, it was originally a song in the 18th century. Catherine, when she's here, would be able to correct me on all these musical errors if I make them. But in any event, it was popular among Irish soldiers in the Napoleonic Wars. But people will Limerick, and I'm from Limerick originally, will know Gary Owen is a region of the city of Limerick. A region which has a very famous rugby club, actually, that comes out of it. So if we have any Shannon rugby supporters, they'll probably switch off now. They're their big rivals. Young Munster, which are my team as well, aren't big fans. But in any event, he chose the name Gary Owen, which is unsurprising. He was from Limerick City, picking that name. But here's what he wrote in November 1864. He said, "We had our Thanksgiving festival, and indeed the patriotic parties who were instrumental in getting it up are deserving more than an ordinary share of praise for the creditable manner in which the affair was managed, as we received an abundance of turkeys, which made the birth deck resemble a poultry market on a small scale. After all being served, the work of dissecting commenced. The cooks pulled off their coats and rolled up their sleeves, transferred the gobblers to the upper deck, and went through the process of immersion in the James with the said gobblers. On Thanksgiving morning, the galley was the centre of attraction, roasting, baking, boiling, stewing, and all the paraphernalia of the culinary department brought into requisition and under full headway. At the usual time, 8 bells announced dinner, when there was a simultaneous attack on the enemy. Talk about storming the enemy's works and taking them by assault, but the attack on the defenceless gobblers throws Sherman's flanking movements in the shade. For in less time than it takes to tell it, they had all disappeared before the terrible onslaught of the sturdy sons of Neptune, and thus was fought the great battle of Thanksgiving on the James." So you get a bit of a sense of his comedic heart there, Brendan, with his, what he was thinking. It's interesting, given he was a labourer, actually, that he's so good at writing. His prose is so good. You might question some of his allusions at what he's trying to achieve, but he's a lot better writing than a lot of other enlisted men in the Navy, and he's making reference to attacks like Sherman's flanking movements that were happening at the same time. And actually, what's interesting about that letter is that they actually do become physically engaged later that day on Thanksgiving. So they're carrying out all of this actually almost in the face of the enemy. They get engaged by a Confederate battery later on that evening, when a smaller vessel is actually sunk. But it's really interesting that he's trying to embrace this Thanksgiving, and he's writing it to other Irish. So it's being read by other Irish in New York about Thanksgiving, and it becomes a really important holiday for them. And it's something you see in other letters. I have examples, a guy now, for example, Thomas McCarthy, who asked his mother for Thanksgiving to send him a present. So she sends him a likeness, a photograph, and a lozenge box, for example. So they're really diving in and embracing this sort of Thanksgiving culture, if you like. And that's telling us something about their embrace of an American culture as well, I think. I know very little about Thanksgiving coming from an Irish background, Brendan. Like, they don't, are gifts and things still a part of Thanksgiving? I presume gobblers certainly are, aren't they?
Yeah. No, yeah, gifts aren't typically part of Thanksgiving.
The standard thing is a congregation to the family, is it?
Yes. Getting together, feasting, watching football, watching the Macy's parade,
Yeah. It's another interesting aspect, actually, of I've seen it in one of the Irish letters, speaking of football, is the embrace of baseball that you see from some of these guys. Like Corcoran's Irish Legion, one of the letter writers there is writing about baseball consistently. Like, he's calling everyone as if they're on different bases. So you get that sport. Football. When did American football start, actually?
I think it had its start in the 19th century, but it wasn't until like later on where it really got traction.
Right. Okay.
I want to say like Teddy Roosevelt gets a lot of credit for popularizing it.
It's something.
Too.
We'll have to do a special on sports in the Civil War.
Yeah,
But
that would be cool because I've seen references to football, but I think a lot of times they're talking about soccer.
right,
At that
yeah,
period, they were calling
yeah,
football soccer in America.
yeah.
I mean, reverse that, but you know what I mean?
Like to go back on the idea of and actually gifts is something that seems to be a bit of a theme in a number of the American holidays that I've seen that they were doing, because 4th of July as well, you see this mentioned sometimes. But it's interesting in the work I was doing on letters that more than Patrick's Day, more than anything else, 4th of July is the holiday gets mentioned the most by Irish immigrants in the army. They're all about the 4th of July. Thanksgiving is mentioned a good bit as well, but 4th of July is a big day. Again, I think just marking out that they were seeing themselves as being American as well as being Irish.
Yeah.
But obviously the other big one is Christmas, which is coming up. And we've a couple of nice quotes from this, but the regimental history of the Irish Brigade, and I should say most of the documents we'll be discussing, a lot of them in any event, and all the ones we're discussing largely this evening, most of them, you can find on the website as well, from different posts over the years. So if you want to search Thanksgiving or Christmas or Fredericksburg even on the site, you'll come across a lot of these type of documents. But Christmas was a really important time for the Irish too, and you can see that in the way they're trying to celebrate it. So this is from the regimental history for 1861. So this is the 3 New York regiments of the Irish Brigade. So they were the only members of the Irish Brigade at that juncture. This is how they remembered their first Christmas in the war. They say, near one of the huge fires, a kind of arbor was nicely constructed of the branches of trees, which were so interwoven on one another as to form a kind of wall. Inside this, some were seated on logs, some reclining in true Turkish style. Seated near the fire was Johnny Flaherty, discoursing sweet music from his violin. Johnny hailed from Boston, was a musical genius in his way, and though only 14 years of age, could play on the bagpipes, piano, and heaven knows how many other instruments. Beside him sat his father, fingering the chanters of a bagpipe in elegant style. It is no wonder that most of the regiment were gathered around there, for it was Christmas Eve, and home thoughts and home longings were crowding on them. And old scenes and fancies would arise with sad and loving memories, until the heart grew weary, and even the truest and tenderest longed for home associations this blessed Christmas Eve. So there's a lot of similarities with current Christmas, and a lot of those guys, of course, would be killed in the battles of 1862. So you're kind of getting a sense of the importance of music, and as well as that, I think it's important that Johnny Flaherty, the 14-year-old, is presumably playing Irish tunes. It would appear that he is from Boston. Another big bugbear of mine is assigning people's ethnicity based on nativity, because that does not work for Irish immigrants in the American Civil War, because so many of them are born in America. So many of the Irish American servicemen are born in America or Canada or Britain. But yeah, so it's an interesting way of how they're like designing their entire camp for this, if you like. You have something on this as well, Brendan, don't you, in relation to?
Yes, the regimental historian of the 9th Massachusetts Irish Regiment, Daniel George McNamara. Let's see. He wrote that the whole camp was decorated with arches of evergreen and ivy and adorned with appropriate mottos. And then, of course, the regiment attended the celebration of Mass, Father Scully as the celebrant, after which the holiday was devoted to innocent enjoyment, said.
Yeah. How innocent that might have been now, I'd say, is another question. That's what they record. But we were just talking about this before we came on, about it's interesting, for example, how they're decorating these areas, and not necessarily, it's not Christmas trees and stuff. A lot of what we have in our decorations now are kind of later, aren't they?
Yeah, I think the Christmas tree was more of a German introduction that wasn't common until later on. So like the garlands of pine and ivy and just greenery, any greenery you could find.
Yeah, because I've seen that in Corcoran's Irish Legion in 1862 did that. It was like you were just walking into a whole area of greenery. They put it on over the tents and arches and everything like that. So they were calling it, I think it was a wonderland was the reference to it. To get you were saying the night Connecticut, though, who were caught out in relation to the ability of their greenery.
Yes,
levels.
so they were stationed on Ship Island on the Gulf Coast of Mississippi for Christmas of 1861. So they were kind of cut off from, a lot of the access to supplies and probably a lot of the greenery and pine that a lot of other regiments have. So let's see. In there, Thomas Hamilton Murray in the regimental history said, or actually he's quoting John G. Healy of New Haven. Oh, how differently was our chapel trimmed from that of St. John's in New Haven. In a large tent with a rough-looking altar before him, Father Mullen often offered up the holy sacrifice of the Mass, with nothing under his feet but the bare ground. After Mass, he preached a sermon, and he repeated the words, "Behold, I bring you glad tidings of great joy." I could, as it were, hear the choir of St. John's singing that beautiful psalm. Ours was the only tent in the island that was trimmed. We got a few bushes and tied them up on the outside and inside of the tent. Some of the boys in the company got up a dinner which was indeed excellent. They bought some potatoes, cabbage, and some preserved turkey, an article which is put up in cans. After they had the table set, they invited us up to their tent, and we certainly had a good dinner, but how different from the Christmas dinners at home. So they kind of made do with what they had.
Yeah.
He doesn't even specify. They just found some bushes and tied them up outside the tent.
I always get the impression Ship Island was a bit of a hard station to be.
It was rough. And I think illness ran rampant too.
Yeah. Canned turkey is certainly something that I hope I die having never tried. Do you have spam over there, by the way? Do you get spam? It's like yeah. I imagine it might be a bit like that. I've never had spam either.
Yeah, I mean, some people make some amazing recipes, I've heard, using spam.
Really? Yeah. We can all try it for Christmas.
Absolutely.
But yeah.
I know there's a big Hawaiian tradition with spam, but that's a whole other conversation.
Really? Okay.
Yeah.
It's mad. I have no idea. My spam knowledge is too low. But and again, we were chatting about this, but the idea of all the canned goods and stuff that they were getting out, like in the efforts as well, you see it in the efforts that people are sending boxes from home and stuff. You often get soldiers writing letters actually where they're going crazy, usually at their mother, for sending some cake or something that is spoiled, like because of the length of time it's taken to get there. So canned goods are certainly the way to go, although, what you're actually getting out them probably wouldn't be very palatable to our 21st century.
Oh yeah.
but
who knows how much of the lead and the solder
and
what preservatives were being used.
No, it doesn't bear thinking about. But it is interesting the efforts that a lot of them are going to, though, in all of these kind of scenarios. I have another one here from Corcoran's Irish Legion. We were just mentioning they also decorated their camp in 1862. But again, it's quite similar to what you see, say, the Irish Brigade doing on Patrick's Day, which I'm sure we'll be probably discussing in March. But Corcoran's Irish Legion get the kind of mass out of the way early. So they say, okay, 10 o'clock in the morning, all the regiments of the brigade had mass. Father Gillen heard it of the 117th New York. But then they had a big program of events that involved playing sports, and in the evening, a lot of drinking, at least for the officers. So the amusements began at 11. So the mass wasn't very long by these standards. To 10 to 11, they were all out and about. And so their program for sports on Christmas Day was horse racing, open to all horses. The winner to receive a silver cup, the second to receive a prize, and also the third, the owner of the last horse in the race, to pay for a basket of wine. So that was all the horse racers were officers. And again, you see some interesting names in some of the horses that are running, like Bull Run. Was what was owned by Michael Corcoran, General Michael Corcoran, of course, captured at Bull Run, and they're wearing colours. Some of them are wearing colours of hunts from Ireland and things like that. One of the other horses in the race was called George Washington. And again, so that's another hark back to kind of an Americanization, like the importance of a figure like George Washington, that they're kind of marking that. But so the men could watch that and no doubt probably bet on it. They also then the enlisted men got to participate not in horse racing, but in a sack race, which presumably was deemed to be more appropriate for their station. Sack racing and three-legged racing seem to have been big deals. They then got to run around after a shaved pig called Mr. Porky and try and catch him. So some of this is almost comedic. And blindfolded wheelbarrow racing was another one of their events. And then they had foot racing as well. So this is all the sort of events they're getting onto. The officers then go on to describe their big shindig of punch and lots of food and lots of alcohol in the evening. We're kind of left to wonder a bit more about what the men were getting up to. But there's a real focus there on that kind of leisure activity and bonding of the unit. Again, the Legion hasn't seen huge action at the point when this is happening. And of course, in the Overland in 1864, a lot of those men would be killed as well. But interesting the effort that they're going to, particularly with this, like within these Irish regiments. And I'm sure in a lot of other regiments as well, they're doing it. But you can see almost the traces of what is happening in St. Patrick's Day and Christmas Day. Like they're taking it to a similar degree of organization on it. But I suppose kind of the last topic we were going to chat about today, given the anniversary, is the Battle of Fredericksburg, which I doubt needs a huge introduction to many of our listeners, but just in case you're not familiar with it, it was a disastrous Union attack on the town of Fredericksburg and its surrounds in December of 1862, where they were very badly beaten, most particularly having moved through the town of Fredericksburg across the Rappahannock River. A succession of brigades threw themselves against these heights called Marie's Heights, where Confederates were ensconced behind a stone wall, really strong position. They had artillery all over the hills, which one Confederate officer described the fact that a chicken, it was quarter, a chicken couldn't live on that field, he's supposed to have said, in relation to the artillery fire that it could bring to bear. And the succession of brigades just attacked this stone wall again and again and again. But one of them was the Irish Brigade. And they had huge casualties at Antietam the previous September, and now that was compounded with devastating casualties as they went up against this stone wall. But it became a really important battle because in many respects, the Irish Brigade, do you agree with this, Brendan? They've taken over the Battle of Fredericksburg from the US Union perspective. Like it is the battle that is most synonymous with the Irish Brigade. They're remembered consistently. If people think about the Stone Wall, they often tend to think about the Irish Brigade. I also find it quite interesting because they didn't. You can debate whether they got closest to the Stone Wall, which is who cares really. But they didn't take the heaviest casualties of any brigade attacking there against the stone wall. But what they really were good at was kind of taking an ownership of it, because it became this big symbol of almost a heroic defeat. And in 1863, when Pickett's charges repulsed at Gettysburg, the soldiers are supposed to have chanted Fredericksburg at them, the Federal soldiers. But just to get a sense,
it was in a lot of ways, it's looked at as sort of the high water mark of the Irish Brigade, that in terms of their numbers and morale, they never quite recovered.
Absolutely,
with Maher psychologically was never the same after Fredericksburg.
Yeah.
Obviously, the Irish Brigade had a long career after that, but in a lot of ways, they were never the same.
You make an interesting point about Maher, controversial here as he was at Antietam as well. But I don't think it's looked at enough in relation to Maher. There's been some stuff about Maher, but Maher, like it's documented in the men's letters, Maher did have a drinking problem. A lot of people had drinking problems. Maher definitely had a bad drinking problem. How it impacted his battlefield performance is unclear. Like, I mean, there's not much, even if he was in the front rank at Fredericksburg, he could have done about it. But it was certainly there. But I never feel it's looked at enough the impact that the losses from the summer of 1862 to December have on him. Like, when we're reading back about these conflicts, you might read about the 7 days, and then you're reading about Antietam, Second Bull Run, Antietam, and Fredericksburg, and you forget that there's weeks between these engagements, that it's an incredibly short length of time. They come on into the summer of 1862, a lot of these people have very limited, if any, combat experience, and suddenly there's a succession of horrific, sharp shocks. So the Irish Brigade heavily engaged at Malvern Hill, for example. They're heavily engaged at Antietam, and then again at Fredericksburg. So in the space of from the start of July through to the start of December, have these huge, devastating losses that they're taking. We have I think it's a pretty good one. And again, it's how quickly these guys come back into action. It's an account just to give a sense of the Irish Brigade at Fredericksburg, and maybe a bit of the blame that they felt was there to go around as well. This is by John Donovan. He was a captain in the famous 69 New York. But Donovan had lost an eye at Malvern Hill in July and is back in charge with his company at Fredericksburg, where he'll ultimately lose his arm. So, and this is a lad in his early 20s. But he wrote a letter from his recovery bed just a couple of weeks after the battle, which, so it's not so much colored by what we would see 20, 30, 40 years later, when the Irish were really staking their claim on Fredericksburg particularly. But he describes the action in terms like this. Like he says, "We have not a single piece of artillery to support us, and yet we stand against shot and shell, grape and canister, mini and conical balls, to fight a formidable enemy artillery and infantry posted behind stone walls and fortifications, with buck and ball fired from Harper's Ferry muskets." They're muskets that were captured by the Confederates at Harper's Ferry just prior to Antietam. "It was impossible for human nature to withstand this, and yet were we left here all afternoon unrelieved. No order to fall back came. The Irish Brigade was left to be sacrificed between the fire of the enemy from the front and flanks and the fire of our own troops, afraid to advance from the rear. The 88th joined the 69th on the left, and these regiments fought together like brothers. No brothers could have greater feelings of real brotherly affection. Their ranks are already horribly thinned, and still leaden rain and iron hail is streaming upon them. But in all of this, there is no terror for men whose choice is death before dishonor. The exasperated feeling caused by the fact that we had not in our power the means to inflict ample retaliation on the enemy for the injuries we were receiving was the most unpleasant feature of all. I take a look along the shattered ranks, an awful sight, see the number of brave fellows now stretched in their gore, who but an hour ago were the personification of life and strength and manliness, who had marched up with stout hearts to the fray, a march only from earth to eternity. They will never march again." So, if he'd written that 20 years later, you wouldn't blink too much about it. Like, that attempt at kind of, we failed, but we did. It was a heroic failure is there, but you can see he's a shaken man at the same time with the losses that they were taking. I think he had to stay there. He was one of the men who had to lie on the ground until nightfall between the lines because he couldn't get back because of it. But
and that experience alone must have been devastating. Like the accounts of the night after the Battle of Fredericksburg, and just the thousands of wounded men between the lines crying out for help, that soldiers would crawl out maybe to provide it, but there were troops on either side waiting to take pot shots at anyone wandering across that darkness. So most of them had to just lie there helplessly, hearing that.
Donovan says that when he eventually managed to get back, he kind of collapses towards the kind of back end of the battlefield. When he's getting back into the town, he says he has his hat shot off. So the fact that there still is fire going, like, they do dominate, and it becomes, I think it's a particularly important Fredericksburg for the Irish in the aftermath of the war, in kind of really laying claim to their involvement in the war, that they really want to cement it. I think it's important to note. I mean, people often ask it. There's a scene in the film Gods and Generals of like the Irish crying at each other. There's Confederate Irish behind the wall shooting the Irish Brigade. That never happened. There was never any evidence of that. And although there were Confederate Irish behind the stone wall, their numbers weren't massive. They're normally overstated. But I always think it's also important to note that there were lots of other Irish, far more than were in the Irish Brigade, spread out among the other federal units. There were guys involved in Rhode Island regiments that we have written about on the site. Thomas Plunkett, Massachusetts regiment, both of his arms are carried off by a shell while he's carrying the US flag towards the stone wall. He receives the Medal of Honor for that. So like there were a lot of Irish there, but it is interesting how this has been concentrated into this kind of heroic failure. And there was a sense that the Irish were being used up, and you saw that you see that a bit in I'll just Donovan ends his letter that they're being used a bit as cannon fodder. He said to say that good generalship was displayed in the whole movement would be to utter a falsehood or to deny oneself of the capacity or judgment to think or see differently. And while I call it bad generalship, I look upon the whole affair as the result of political strategy and the pressure of radicalism on the action and plans of a good general. It appears of late to be the sole purpose of certain class of politicians to sacrifice the Army of the Potomac for the design to kill certain generals and to make room for others. So that's pretty strong stuff. Donovan is clearly a Democrat, very clearly a Democrat, but it's political for them.
And in the wake of losing their beloved McClellan, who was a Democrat too, it probably left a really bitter taste in their mouths even before Fredericksburg.
Yeah. And I think it's important to state that the Irish Brigade are often pointed to because of their huge casualty figures, like was there nativism going on? Was there anti-immigrant stuff going on? But actually, there's no evidence really for that. They were in the second corps of the Army of the Potomac, who were effectively being used consistently through much of this period as like the attack arm of the army. But they do have some interesting justification. A lot of regiments were allowed to go home after Fredericksburg to refit, and the Irish Brigade were not. And I've come across again an enlisted man's letter just after in January, where he specifically states that their feeling is that they're not allowed to go home because they're Irish, that they'll just be used up again and again and again until they're all gone, while the lads who were born in America are allowed to go home. So that feeling was there. Whether it was true or not is almost secondary again, because it was felt by men who were in the brigade. But yeah, and we'll mention it, I'm sure, in July when Gettysburg comes around. But by the time they take the field at Gettysburg, as you were saying earlier, Brendan, like they're barely, they certainly are nowhere near a brigade. There's only a handful of them really. That Fredericksburg is the death of the original Irish Brigade, if you like, as a major fighting force. Yeah, I mean, I think, having whizzed through those three quotes, three topics, we'll be refining things as things go on. But that's kind of, we're looking to just kind of have more conversations around these type of documents and these type of objects and things. Hopefully we'll be back with another one of these episodes. We're thinking maybe hopefully in late January, but we'll try and put one out every few weeks. Discussing these different topics. And of course, if any of you have any thoughts or questions or anything you would like discussed, do drop us a line in relation to them or leave a comment when you're seeing the video. We'd be happy to discuss or even expand on any of the points we've had in this brief chat. Do you have anything to add, Brendan?
I do. I have another one last thing on Fredericksburg. Is there's another
good
9th Massachusetts quote there from Daniel McNamara,
cool.
reflecting on Daniel McNamara of the 9th Massachusetts. And so they were in the Union 5th Corps, but they also attacked Mary's Heights. And he circles back on the theme of Christmas, but it's a big contrast to what Christmas was like the year prior. And he writes that Christmas time in 1862 was a gloomy period, not only in the Army of the Potomac, but throughout the homes of the United States. Christmas Day was remembered and quietly observed in the 9th Regiment. The great American turkey was conspicuous by his absence from our dinner tables. It served to remind us of the homes so far away where many vacant chairs stood, chairs that were never to be filled again by many of the absent ones, around the family tables on which the majestic birds reposed after their release from a hot oven. The soldier could not afford to dwell on thoughts of home and all its creature comforts long at a time, and they generally took wings and went up with the smoke that he contentedly puffed from his pipe.
That's a great quote, isn't it? That's brilliant. It's the low point, isn't it, for the Army of the Potomac? They talk about Fredericksburg then combined with that mud march that happens, that kind of disastrous effort where everyone gets mired in meters deep mud, and the whole army seems to be saying, what's going on here? A succession of defeats, and we're being dragged back and forth in the middle of winter. And of course, there's lots of things feeding into it for particularly for a lot of the Irish in relation to things like the Emancipation Proclamation and things which I'm sure we'll discuss more later. A lot of them weren't terribly pleased. That would be a radical understatement. They were very displeased with the Emancipation Proclamation. So when you combine that with all the losses and people thinking, what's it all about? It's interesting to consider. That's a good juxtaposition, actually, that Christmas in the Army of the Potomac in 1862 versus, that 1861 Irish Brigade where nobody's fired a shot yet, and they're all having a good time listening to their music. Yeah. Okay, that's great. Yeah, so I suppose that's a good quote to leave it on for our episode 1. Yeah, so do let us know if you have any questions or queries, or even if you're interested in any of the sources that we've been chatting about. We can let you know about them. So cool. We'll say cheerio to everybody for now.
Bye.